like I said earlier, this is a presentation for Workgroup PDM, and we've called it Workgroup Warning Signs. And the idea behind this presentation is that we're going to talk about some of the issues people are facing on a day-to-day basis in the Workgroup PDM system, as well as some best practices and some tips on how to possibly solve some of those issues. And so if we look at the agenda I've got right here, we're going to go through a couple different topics today. And unfortunately, I have to apologize. This is mostly a PowerPoint presentation. I am going to show a few things in Workgroup PDM, but a lot of this stuff is going to be coming straight off PowerPoint slides. This presentation will be recorded, and the PDF of this PowerPoint will be available to you guys probably about a week after this presentation, so look for it sometime next week on our website. But the first thing we're going to do is go through some of the warning signs, just so you know what's coming. Then, in order to really understand why these things are happening, we're going to talk a little bit about the background of Workgroup PDM and a lot about the actual architecture of how the program works, because that architecture is where these issues arise from. Then we're going to talk about those warning signs and what actually causes them in relation to the architecture of the system. Then we're going to go through some best practices and tips on how to increase your performance and maybe solve some of these problems. And then last but not least, we're going to close that up with a summary and some few notes for you guys. So let's start off with the warning signs. Those of you who got the email invitation have seen a few of these already. These are very common things to see happening if your vault is not running optimally. So you got slow check-in or check-out times and slow searching times. Those are probably the two ones that we hear about the most, probably because those are the things that users are doing the most on a day-to-day basis. You could also see very slow times to build reports if you use the reporting feature. You may see files disappearing from the vault view. You know, you're working on a file, you check it into a project, and you don't see the name of the file show up on that project. That's actually a very common issue that we hear a lot about. You could have trouble finding references when opening assemblies in SOLIDWORKS. Sometimes that can have to do with Workgroup PDM and the way it's set up. You may be seeing poor performance in SOLIDWORKS when the workgroup add-in is active, yet if you turn the workgroup add-in off, you'll see those performance issues go away. There's a couple things we can do to tweak that just to get a little bit better performance. And last but not least, if anybody is the Vault admin or works on the server side of things, you may see the service actually crashing. Now, if the service is crashing, that's probably the most catastrophic thing that could happen to Workgroup, and it's usually a conglomeration of some of the things that are happening above, some of the other warning signs. So we'll talk about that and why it happens as well. And I have a little bullet point there. Each of these issues is ultimately telling us the same thing. Your Workgroup Vault needs a little bit of attention. And so to understand where the attention needs to go, and really to set realistic expectations of how Workgroup should work, we want to understand how the program is architected. So the first thing I want you guys to understand is that Workgroup PDM was not originally created by SOLIDWORKS. This is a product. It was initially called PDM Works. It was created in 1999 by a company named Design Source Technology, and they were a SOLIDWORKS partner. What that means is that they were licensed the software and they could create it through the API, but this was not SOLIDWORKS actually creating the product and doing development. The logic behind why they created this tool was to give designers revision control during the design process, because at the time, most traditional PDM systems focused on after the design process, what happens in the release life cycle. So it became very popular. You know, small groups were using it, larger groups was using it. It was really one of the best offerings out there at the time for SOLIDWORKS, because like I said, it allowed you to rev control during the design process. Because it was so popular, in 2002, SOLIDWORKS actually purchased it. At that point in time, they renamed the product to PDM Works Workgroup. They purchased the company and all its developers, so they all came across to work for SOLIDWORKS, and it became an in-house developed SOLIDWORKS product at that point. And it stayed in-house developed at SOLIDWORKS from that time until now. The only real huge change that has happened to it is that in 2007 they renamed it one more time. They call it SOLIDWORKS Workgroup PDM now, and that just kind of aligned it with a new naming strategy. So that's the background behind the tool. Let's look a little bit at the architecture on how the tool actually runs. So most of the issues that you're going to see in Workgroup are attributed to the architecture of the tool. It was made in 1999. The architecture hasn't changed since. And when it was created for a very scaled down purpose. So some of this architecture is not what you would call modern. And that's why we're seeing some of these issues. So if you look at the two components that make up the Workgroup PDM tool on the server, what you have is a service. That service runs and monitors and handles all the transactions that happen. So whether you're checking in, you're checking out, you're searching, you're building a report, whatever you're doing, that service on the server is monitoring and controlling those transactions. The other component you have is the Vault Data folder. This is the folder on the server where all the physical file information is actually being stored. And that folder and what gets stored in that folder is obviously being controlled by that service. So those are the two components of the Workgroup PDM system you have on the server. Now, I've got down there at the bottom, and this is the big thing, this is the basis for most of the issues. There is no database running behind Workgroup PDM. And what I mean by that is there's nothing like SQL or Oracle running behind the tool, behind the service to help boost its performance. And as I go through this, I'll get into why that is a big deal. So if we dive a little deeper into the Vault Data folder, what you're going to see is that it has 6 main top-level folders. Okay, there may be an extra folder in there depending on where you do your updates or anything, but if we look at this screenshot I've got, you can see the 6 main top-level folders. So it's got a folder called _temp. That folder stores a list of transactions that are currently in process. You've got a folder called _transactions, which is going to store the data for any of the transactions that are in process. You've got a folder called data, and it's a little, well, calling it data doesn't actually say what it does because it's storing indexing data. So there's an option in the Vault to turn on indexing and use that with the Windows indexing service. If you turn that on, it stores its indexing catalog in this data folder. That's not where the actual files are stored though. You've got an obsolete folder, and that obsolete folder is storing any projects that you may have deleted from the Vault. So if you delete an entire project, they go into this obsolete folder. It's sort of like a recycle bin. And so you can either completely remove them for there, or you can keep them there and restore them. Now each project will have its own obsolete folder, so if you delete singular files, they'll go into the obsolete folder of their particular project. You've got a PDM RC folder, and that PDM RC folder stores all the administrative files for the Vault. So things like user settings, permissions, groups, revision scheme, things of that nature. You've got the projects folder, and this is really the main folder that we're going to deal with inside the Vault. This is where all your actual physical files and their revisions are stored. So we're going to dig really deep into that and see how it's architected. What you may also see is a folder called updates. You can see I don't have that in my screenshot, but if you've updated your Vault, that folder will be in there so that it can push out the updates to the actual client machines. Because if you guys use Workgroup, you know that the server and the clients have to be on the exact same service pack. You may also see a couple log files in there depending on how your settings are set up. You're always going to see this server.log file, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the end too because it can have an impact on performance as well. So if we browse into that projects folder, what you're going to see is that there is a folder for every project that you have in the vault. Now those of you who are longtime Workgroup PDM users, you know that you can't have two projects in the vault of the same name. And what I mean by that is if you had a top level project called 2010 and a top level project called 2009, you cannot have two sub-projects named Boeing. You would have to have the sub-project Boeing 2010 and a sub-project Boeing 2009. And this is why. Because when you look here in this projects folder, what you're going to see is that there's no hierarchy. It doesn't matter if we come down here and we look at one of these subfolders. We see a subfolder called fasteners. Okay, if we look over into projects, you can see that fasteners is at the same level as its parent folder, common files. This again is why, because of Windows, you can't have two sub-projects of the same name. This is just the way Workgroup works, and this is the way it stores those things. Okay, so in each of those, you pick a project and you browse into the project folder. What you're going to see is a couple different things. So you're going to see a subfolder for every file in the project. You'll see a folder called latest, an obsolete folder, and then a PDM-RC folder. So let me go over to the screenshot here. We are now in, if you look at the path, we're in the Vault Data, Projects, and we're inside a folder for a project called UJoint. Inside this folder, I see a bunch of folders, bracket underscore SLDPRT, crankarm underscore SLDPRT. Those are actual files that exist in this project. So every file that exists in the project is going to have its own folder, and it's going to be file name underscore file extension. So if I had something called sop.pdf, it's going to have a folder sop underscore pdf. That's just the method that Workgroup uses. You're also going to have three folders in addition to that. You're going to have a folder called latest, and there is an option in the Workgroup admin tool to keep an extra copy of the latest revision of every file. It's for things like corruption, scares, and things like that. If you're keeping an extra copy of the latest version of every file, they get stored in that latest folder. They don't get stored where the normal files get stored, again, because of fears of corruption and stuff like that. You've got an obsolete folder, and like I said, if you delete an actual file from its project, it will go into the project's obsolete folder. You can restore files out of there. It requires a little bit special of a procedure. If you want to do something like that, you can call our tech support guys. They can walk you through how to do that. You've also got a PDM-RC folder. This stores information about the project. And more importantly, it's going to store two text files. And I don't have a screenshot of this, so I'm actually going to pull Windows Explorer up and show you guys what this would look like. So if I browse into that same area, UJoint, and I browse into my PDM-RC folder, what we're going to see is a bunch of these .pdmw files. And these are just text files that have the PDMWorks workgroup extension on them. There's two of them here that are really important though, tree.pdmw and treeinfo.pdmw. These are the text files that build the view of the project. So when you're in SOLIDWORKS and you browse that project and you see a bunch of files underneath it, the only reason you're seeing those things is because of these two text files right here. And if you were to open one of these text files, you can see what I'm saying. It's just a list of all the file names, and they've got numbers next to them that tell it what level they are. So that's how it understands the parent-child relationship. If these tree files get messed up or corrupted, that's when you start to see things in the Vault view disappear. Files that you know are in a particular project not showing up anymore. So that's something that we're going to talk about as we go through this as well. Now if we were to browse into one of the actual file folders here, we're going to see a couple other things. So I got a list of stuff here. I'm just going to show you the screenshot and go through them one by one. So the first thing you're going to see is a folder for each revision that the file has existed in. So in this case, we're in the ujoint project, and we're in the folder ujoint_SLDASM. So this is the ujoint solid assembly file. And what I've got is a folder -.01, -.02, -.03, and A. So that's telling me this particular file has gone through 4 revisions. In addition to those revision folders, I've got a history.pdmw file and a revisions.pdmw file. These contain basically exactly what they say. The history.pdm file is the history of the actual file, so who checked it in, who changed its life cycle state, who changed its properties, all those historical references that Workgroup keeps for us. And then the revisions.pdmw file is just a list of the revisions that it's gone through right now. And it should match these folders. So if we browse into one of those actual folders, this is where we're finally going to find data. So again, we go to the screenshot of this. We're inside the A folder now, so this is the revision A. The first thing I have is an _SLDASM file. That is the actual SOLIDWORKS file. And what Workgroup does is it strips off the file name and it renames it to _SLDASM. That's its way of protecting the file. If you took that file right there and you renamed it to ujoint.SLDASM, it's a perfectly valid SOLIDWORKS file and it would open in SOLIDWORKS. This is just the sort of like little method of encrypting the files. Then you've also got 3 PDMW files. So properties.pdmw, those are the properties, the custom properties in SOLIDWORKS for this file at revision A. You've got a references file, that is the references for this file at revision A. And then you got the swconfig file, that is the SOLIDWORKS configurations that exist for this file at revision A. And the reason I keep saying at revision A is because you have these text files, they exist for every revision, as well as the SOLIDWORKS file. That's how it keeps track of the history. So we had 4 revision folders, so I've got 4 folders that have these same things in them. So within those 4 folders, I've got 16 files. And that's going to come into play in a second when we start talking about what these PDM files do and how they work. Okay? So, get to this slide. Why do issues exist? Okay? There's a few things that we need to consider before we start talking about exactly what each of these problems causes, right? The first is that there's no database. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what a database program does, and these are programs like SQL or Oracle, basically they collect metadata and they store it in a way that can be accessed quickly and easily. And when I talk about metadata, I'm talking about things like the custom properties. So you've got those text files in the vault, those PDMW files. Those files are metadata. So the way that Workgroup collects metadata is through a series of text files instead of through database tables. This really hampers the speed and the efficiency of accessing that metadata, because instead of being able to query a database table, which is specifically designed to store metadata, the service actually has to open the text file, load it into RAM, and read it. This takes significantly longer than it would have to just query a database table. And so imagine, if you would for a second, opening multiple text files. This is where your server really starts to get bogged down. And this is just an inherent flaw in the way the Workgroup system was set up. And it's because when it was created, they didn't really foresee it being used the way people are using it today. They didn't foresee it being used to store hundreds of gigs of data with 10 or more engineers. That's just not what the creators of the tool foresaw, and that's why they didn't put a database in it. Okay, The other thing that we need to point out is that Workgroup PDM is only a 32-bit program. What that means is the service on the server can only run in 32-bit mode. So even if you have a 64-bit server with a ton of RAM on it, that's not going to do Workgroup PDM any good because it has the RAM limitation that is inherent in a 32-bit system. What that means is that when it's done accessing the amount of RAM a 32-bit system can access, it's going to crash. So as the service is loading up these text files, and it loads up these text files for a number of different reasons that we're going to talk about, it starts to use RAM on the server. And as it continues using RAM, if you get to that breaking point, that limitation that comes in a 32-bit system, that's when you're going to start to see crashes. What you're also going to notice is that as it's using more and more RAM, it's going to get slower and slower and slower. If it was a 64-bit program, some of those issues would go away because there are no RAM limitations and it can just use as much RAM as you have in your system. Unfortunately, though, that's not the case here with Workgroup. And then the other thing we want to point out is that it's a single service to handle all transactions. And again, this points back to not having a database in the background. If you had a database, you would have two services, one that manages the database and one that manages the actual physical files. Here we've got one service that is in charge of managing both the metadata and the physical file transactions. So it's really easy to bog this service down, especially if multiple transactions are happening at the same time. If you guys have multiple users checking in or searching or doing different things all at the same time, it's a real burden for this single service to handle that. And then the last thing that's not necessarily a server thing, but is a user workstation thing. So Workgroup PDM has what you could call a user controllable local workspace. Those of you who are very into the Workgroup PDM system, I'm sure you know what I mean when I say the working folder. Okay? The problem with the working folder in Workgroup PDM is that every user can have a different working folder. And so let's pretend for a second that my name is Bob and I've got a folder on my desktop called Working. Well, the path to that folder is C, Documents and Settings, Bob, Desktop, Working. Okay? Then you go over to another user, John, and he's got a working folder on his desktop. The path to that is C, Documents and Settings, John, Desktop, Working. So when John opens an assembly that Bob was working on, it is looking for files on Bob's desktop. That's just the way SOLIDWORKS works. When you're working with SOLIDWORKS files and you're saving those files, it remembers location information in the header of the SOLIDWORKS file. So what it tries to do when you open the assembly is look for files in the same location that they were saved to. Now, there's quite the algorithm that SOLIDWORKS uses, in fact, to go through and figure out where it's going to look for files, and that's just one of the locations. So if you set your Workgroup PDM system up right, and you use a consistent local workspace, and I'm going to talk about this when we get to tips, you're going to control a lot of the issues that you may be seeing right now. People can't find information because it's supposedly stored on someone else's computer. So I'll give you some tips on how to handle that. But those are kind of your four main sticking points in the Workgroup PDM architecture. So let's go through now and take a look at each of these warning signs we talked about in the beginning and why it relates back to that architecture and why it can happen. So the first one, and one of the ones that we hear about the most, is slow check-in or check-out times. Now, on a normal system that's functioning well, you'll see check-in, check-out times range from anywhere from 2 seconds to 5 minutes. That's a normal range. So if you're seeing anything in that range right now, consider the fact that you're doing pretty good. And it'll depend on how fast your connection is to the server and things like that. But anything from in a couple seconds to 5 minutes is something that you're going to be able to deal with. Anything longer than that, especially for smaller assemblies, if you have super huge assemblies and they take maybe 10 minutes, you're still kind of in an okay range. But if you're starting to see 15, 20 minutes, I've even been out to a customer where it takes an hour to do a check-in. These are big problems. And the reason that this is a big problem is because when you check a file in or check a file out, the Workgroup PDM service on the server has to load all of the text files into RAM. So you've got basically 5 text files per SOLIDWORKS file. You got the history file, the revisions file, the properties file, the config file, and the references file. All those files have to be open on the server during the check-in and check-out process in case any of them have to change. Remember, they're text files, so if information changes, they have to be open, written to, and saved. Okay, so if you're just checking out a SOLIDWORKS file, it's not a big deal. The service has to open 5 text files, big deal, right? But if you're checking out a SOLIDWORKS assembly, say you got just a 50-part SOLIDWORKS assembly, that's 51 files that you're opening, the assembly plus its 50 references. And since they each have 5 text files, that's 255 text files that are open. Now that's a lot more than just 5 text files, and I wish I could give you a hard number in the sand of how many text files the service can handle, but it really does vary. There is no hard number there, but you think for a second, if you've got a 50-piece assembly and you've got 4 or 5 other co-workers dealing with 50-piece assemblies, you've got well over 1,000 text files open into RAM on the server, and you got to start to think that at that load and at that level, you're going to start to see some performance degradation because you're starting to climb that RAM limit that the service can handle. Okay? So when you do see slow check-in, check-out times, like I say, anything over than 5 minutes, you probably want to call us so that we can talk about it. There were some issues in the past, certain versions of SOLIDWORKS with certain versions of Microsoft installed, where there were some check-in issues that weren't necessarily related to the server. So there's a slight possibility that could be your issue. But more than likely, it's just going to be because of the large number of transactions that your service is having to manage. Okay, the same kind of thing goes with the slow searching times. Now, when you're opening an assembly, or you're opening a file, it's loading those 5 text files into RAM. It's not necessarily doing that when you search, depending on what you search on. However, what it's going to do is it's going to open at least 1 text file for every file in the vault. So let's pretend that you've got your entire vault and you want to search it for every piece that's made of steel. So every file in your vault that has the SOLIDWORKS material of steel. What the service has to do is actually come through and open all of those property.pdmw files to read the custom properties and build a list of ones that meet your criteria. So if you have 5,000 files in the vault, that is 5,000 text files that have to get open and read before it can return a search result to you. Now those 5,000 text files don't all have to be open at the same time. It's going to go through and it's going to open a couple at a time depending on how it can handle it. But trying to run through all those text files, you can really start to see why you get lag on this, right? Opening all those files is going to take time. And when you start to add additional criteria to that, you're going to say, okay, we want all the material equals steels, but we only want them where the configuration is called forging. Now you've got to open those swconfig.pdmw files, and that's another 5,000 files that you got to look through. So now you're looking through 10,000 files to match these things up. Okay, and this is really where searching can start to slow down. And again, I've seen searches take, 10, 15 minutes just to find a simple search in a vault. And you may have, 5,000 files is, a small estimate for most people. Most people have over 10 to 20,000 files in their vault, depending on how long they've been using it for. So, and again, this all comes back to that limitation that it's only 32-bit. Because it's only 32-bit, it can only open so many text files at a time without choking itself, and so it's going to take longer than if it was a 64-bit program. Now, this also comes back to there's no database in the system. Because in a database, all it has to do is query a table. It doesn't have to open any files, it doesn't have to do anything like that. It just does a query in a table and it returns the information. It's significantly faster to have a database in the background. So that's why you're going to see slow searching times. Now, slow report build times, basically the same thing as slow check-in, check-out with a little mix of slow searching. When you do a report, you're going to basically be opening the text files associated with what you're trying to do a report on. So if you do a report on a project, it's going to open the text files for every file in that project, and it's going to build the report for you. In this case, it's not just the assembly and its components, it's anything in that project folder, whether they're related or not. So you could be opening, again, a lot of different text files, and if you're trying to run a report on an entire vault, it's going to take a long time to generate that report depending on how many files you have in your vault. Okay, so now, this next one, files disappearing from the vault view. We talked about this a little bit already, and it has to do with those tree.pdmw files. Okay, so those tree.pdmw files, they're text files just like anything else. So if you have a new file, that you're checking into the vault and you check it in, the server has to open the tree.pdmw file for that project, write the new information into it, save it, and close it. That way the view, your vault view inside SOLIDWORKS, is going to update. And the vault view is what you see over in the right-hand side of your SOLIDWORKS window. Okay? So in order for that all to happen smoothly, we're assuming the server has enough resources to open that tree.pdmw file, write to it, and save it back. If for some reason that doesn't happen, this is when you start to see files quote-unquote disappearing from the vault view. You know that file's there, you saved it there, you try to check it in again, it tells you it already exists, but you can't see it in the list. This happens occasionally, like I say, especially when the server's overloaded. There is a way to take care of this, to fix it, and that's going to come up in our tips section that we're nearing here. Okay, another issue is trouble finding references. So you're opening an assembly, and you're John, but it's looking for files on Bob's desktop. This typically traces back to having uncontrolled user working directories. If you have lots of different users and they're not using a consistent working directory, then this is going to happen. The other situation where you might run into issues with this is with toolbox files. The workgroup vault can store toolbox files in two different ways. It can keep them outside the vault in a non-revision controlled state, or it can put them in the vault and revision control them. Depending on how you have that set up, and if you've ever changed from one method to the other during the course of using the vault, you may have issues finding the proper references with those toolbox files. So that's another something to keep your eye on. Okay, another point here is poor performance in SOLIDWORKS with the workgroup add-in active. So you've got an assembly open, you're zooming in, you're zooming out, you're rotating, whatever you're doing, it's taking a long time, it's being sluggish. However, if you go to Tools Add-ins and you turn the workgroup add-in off, you'll notice that those issues go away. So, if those issues go away, obviously there's something wrong with the workgroup add-in. And the main thing, the typical thing that we see to go wrong there is actually the comparison, right? So everybody knows that if you're in the vault view or the local view, you're going to get these little comparison icons. It's a little equal sign, or it's a green circle, or it's a red circle, basically telling you, hey, this file is equivalent to what's in the vault, it's newer than what's in the vault, or it's older than what's in the vault. Well, those comparison icons require your computer continually communicating with the server to check the status of those files in case you make any changes or someone else makes a change. And that is where you could start to see slowdown and performance degradation with the workgroup add inactive. We've got a little solution to maybe help you with that as well. So getting close to talking about that. And then the last thing, we talked about this quite a few times already, is that the service crashes. You've got 5 people checking out, 2 people running a search, and a person building a report, and all of a sudden that service, that one single service that can only access 32-bit capabilities, is overwhelmed and it's going to crash. Well, when the service crashes, the vault goes down. When the service is crashed, you just have nothing to do with anything. You have to restart it, and all your users are out of the system until it restarts. So this is the most catastrophic thing you can have happen. Now I've got a good question here. It says, are any of the issues I've described exacerbated by working over a slow network, i.e. accessing the vault via VPN from a remote location? The answer to that question is yes, right? A lot of the communication between the tool has to deal with clients communicating with the server. So slow checkout times, slow searching times, slow check-ins, things like that, those can definitely be made worse by using a slow connection, because not only is the server running into limitations, but trying to transfer the data to your client computer is running into limitations based on the slow network. So that's almost like a double whammy. I can guarantee you that if you're working on Workgroup over a VPN, you're going to see poor performance compared to the people working locally. That's just a given, the way that VPNs work most of the time. Okay, so now we talked about why these issues exist. Let me pause for a second and ask if anybody has questions before I talk about some solutions and some things that we can look into to help this. I give you guys a few seconds to type anything, if you can think of anything, and if I don't see anything in the next few seconds here, probably go ahead and continue. Alright, well, it's looking like not too many questions. Okay, well, let me go ahead and continue. Oh, you know what? We do have some questions. First question is, what if we need to share data with another location and you don't want them to use a VPN because you're worried about the performance aspect of it? Unfortunately, there's really no way that Workgroup can help you there. Workgroup is a single site tool. It's only meant to be used at one site. So if you're going to access it remotely, you have to access it through a VPN. If you want to do actual replication from one site to another site and not use VPN, you got to look into a program that has a different architecture. Unfortunately, that's just a limitation of Workgroup. Here's a good question. How many text files roughly to crash the RAM limit? Unfortunately, there's no hard number. Right? These text files are going to vary in size and complexity. There's nothing I could tell you in terms of a limit that you're going to run into. What I can say is this. In our customer base, we have seen performance issues start when your Vault data folder is 60 gigs. We've seen performance issues not start until your Vault data folder turns into 100 gigs. So you're really just going to have to monitor it and talk to the users to see when these things are happening, because there's just not a tool that we can use to access that. Good question right here. Any plans to upgrade PDMWorks Workgroup to 64-bit? Unfortunately, there's not. If you guys haven't heard this already, it's kind of on the blogs and stuff like that. SOLIDWORKS has put Workgroup PDM into, I don't want to say a hibernate mode, but they're no longer adding functionality to the tool. So all they're doing with Workgroup PDM is maintaining it and making it compatible with the latest releases of SOLIDWORKS. They're not adding any features to the program whatsoever. So it's going to be continued and it's going to be supported for many years to come, but you're never going to see any enhancements to it anymore. We've got a question here. Aside from slow check-in, check-out time, is there any other chronic issue using a VPN for occasional correspondence? Absolutely not. You know, if your only option is to use a VPN and you're okay with the little bit of performance degradation that you're going to get checking in, checking out, and searching, there is zero problems using a VPN. Now, currently in 2010, there is an issue using a VPN with SOLIDWORKS. So for those of you using SOLIDWORKS network licenses, the floating licenses, there's a problem right now checking out network licenses over a VPN, and that would obviously affect Workgroup, because if you can't open SOLIDWORKS, you can't open Workgroup. But that issue's under development, and SOLIDWORKS is trying to get a fix for that as soon as they can. Can I further discuss methods for dealing with the toolbox issues? Unfortunately, I don't have that in this presentation, although I would certainly be happy to talk with people who are interested about that offline for sure. Let's see, is PDMWorks Workgroup going to be supported in the long term since PDMWorks Enterprise is out? So this is a good question. PDMWorks Enterprise is SOLIDWORKS' future program. This is the program that they're going to add functionality and add capability to. However, they have assured us that Workgroup PDM is going to be supported for many, many, many years in the future. They're definitely not going to kill support for it. They're just not going to be adding features to it anymore. Okay, if SOLIDWORKS crashes regularly, could this be associated with PDMWorks performance? It's hard to say. If SOLIDWORKS is crashing regularly, I suggest you get in touch with our tech support people. They have a series of tests they can run to determine the root of your crashing issue. It may be coming from PDMWorks, though I'd say that's a long shot. It's probably something else. Why does SOLIDWORKS crash at the end of a check-in? Again, that's a really good question. I can't say off the top of my head. I suggest that you contact our tech support people and have them run you through the series of these tests. Let's see, does this mean we shouldn't expect a 64-bit version of PDMWorks Workgroup? That is exactly what I'm saying. Don't expect a 64-bit version of PDMWorks Workgroup. Is there a maximum number of folders, subfolders, or files in a working folder for PDMWorks? That is a fantastic question. I'm going to talk about working folders a little bit, but let me tell you this. Windows gets really itchy if you have more than 2,000 to 3,000 files in a folder. That is just a physical Windows limitation. So if you've got a working folder where you're storing your files in, I would suggest trying to keep the number of files in that folder under 2,000 for the best type of performance. Why is there no intermediate step between Workgroup PDM and Enterprise PDM? That's a good question. Basically, Enterprise PDM, the way that it works, is it can be configured to do exactly the same thing as Workgroup PDM, or it can be configured to do a whole lot more. So there's really no reason for an intermediary step. And if you were to look at the cost of actually buying a single Workgroup license versus a single Enterprise license, the costs are surprisingly similar. So again, there's really no need to have an intermediary step right there. Let's see. Any comments on a 22.5 gig vault with 108,000 files and 33,000 folders? Yeah, again, Keith, that's really hard for me to say. There's no hard numbers out there. If you've noticed a performance degradation, you probably want to pay attention to some of these tips that I'm going to give to see if it can get cleaned up. I would say that 22 gigs seems a little small to be experiencing serious performance issues, but again, there's lots of factors that can turn into that. What is the best way to move Windows file-based files and folders to Workgroup PDM? I'm going to leave that one for offline, Craig. If you want to talk to me after the demonstration, we can talk about that a little. Okay, is PDMWorks Enterprise 64-bit and does it use a database architecture? Yes and yes. Everything in Enterprise PDM is 64-bit and it uses Microsoft SQL Server as its database architecture in the background. I was going to try not to talk too much about Enterprise in this presentation. If anybody has questions about Enterprise afterwards, I'd be happy to answer them. It is a significantly faster, significantly more stable program if you want to get into it. Let's see. Let me see if there's any more of these. I think I'm going to go ahead and continue just so we can finish. I've got quite a few more questions that I want to come back to, though. So we'll come back to some of these questions at the end. Let me go into the tips and tricks sections right now, sort of the best practices. Okay, so the first best practice I've got listed here, I hope you guys have all heard of this. It's called vault validation. Okay, vault validation is a process you can run on your Workgroup PDM vault that basically goes through every file stored in the vault and checks the validity of the file. So this works especially well for those little text files like the tree files. So if you're noticing issues where files are disappearing from the vault view, run your vault through a validation. It'll go through, it'll check those text files. If they're invalid, it will rebuild them. It's not going to rebuild SOLIDWORKS files, obviously, but if it finds issues in SOLIDWORKS files, it'll let you know through the log file. This vault validation should be done at least once a month. In my opinion, this is the second most important thing you can do to your Workgroup PDM vault other than actually backing the vault up. And the way you do this is you go into your Vault Admin tool, you turn the validation flag on, you stop the service, and then you restart the service. It's very simple. You should note, and I have this written in bold here, that if your vault is very large, this operation could take upwards of an hour or more to run because it really is going in there and checking out all these files. The vault is going to be inaccessible until the validation is over, so you should plan this accordingly. Typically, you want to do it on a Friday night or something like that. We're not going to have users having to access the vault. Okay, I've got a little screenshot here on the second slide. This is our Vault Admin tool. You can see over on the right-hand side that you've got the option to validate the vault. You can do this every startup, which means every time the service starts, or you can do it only on the next startup. Depending on how your server is set up and how often you turn it off and on, and if you turn the services off, you'll choose one of those options, whatever fits best to you. Okay, that is the number one thing. If you guys have never heard of this and never validated your vault, what I want you to do is validate it tonight or validate it Friday night. That is step one in getting good performance out of your vault. Okay, the next thing is proper folder management. And this goes to one of the questions that I was asked about the working directory. This works on the server too. The way that Workgroup works, you should have no more than 2,000 files per project. Ideally, you want to have less than 1,000 files per project. And this is because of those tree.pdm files. As you start to add more and more and more information to those tree.pdm files, it takes longer and longer and longer to generate the vault view. So the smaller those tree.pdmw files are, the faster it's going to generate your vault view for you. And this is going to improve performance a little bit inside of SOLIDWORKS. So more sub-projects you have, the better. The less files per project, the better. It's going to help out. Okay, the next thing is log file management. So we saw when we were looking at the vault that right under that vault data folder, we've got this server.log file. Okay, that server.log file logs everything that happens in the vault. Okay, so it grows and grows and grows and grows and grows continuously. And what happens here is that the server.log file is always open in RAM so that the service can add stuff to it as things happen. I've seen people whose server.log files were a gig in size. I don't know if you guys have ever tried this before, but opening a text file that's 1 gig takes forever. So you want to clear this server.log file. One of the tricks that I'll use is that I'll create a copy of it and I will name it the range of dates that it goes from, like 6/1 to 7/1 or something like that. I will move that copy somewhere else so that I can keep it, so that I always have the history of my log stuff, and then I'll delete everything that's in it. It's basically just a text file. You can open it up in Notepad and you can delete everything that's in it. And you should do that once a month when you're doing your vault validation. That way the server log file is always the optimal size. It's never going to get too large. Okay, so one of the next things is the proper local workspace setup. So we talked about this. This is a big deal, okay? Everyone in your company should be using the exact same working directory. If you have C Bob desktop working and C John desktop working and C Susan desktop working, you're going to have issues with file references. So the absolute best thing to do is give everybody a working folder on the C drive. C working, C PDM working, C files, whatever you want to call it. I don't really care what the folder name is. It should be at the root of the C drive, and it should be the same on everyone's computer, because if it's C working, it doesn't matter if it's on Bob's computer or John's computer or Susan's computer, it's going to be the same path. So when you open assembly, it's looking at C working all the time. You're not going to have this confusion between computers. The other thing that you can do on your local machines to help out is you can turn off those comparison icons. So through the PDMWorks user options, you're going to be able to change whether you see those icons or not. So over here on the next slide, I've got some screenshots. When you're in SOLIDWORKS, you can right-click in your Vault view, and you can choose SOLIDWORKS Workgroup PDM options. Then if you click on the Folders tab, it will allow you to set where you want your folder to be. By the way, the default option is use the most recently used SOLIDWORKS folder. So what that means is that every time you check out a file, it could be putting it in a different folder. You never really know where it's going to go. Okay, so you should definitely set that to use folder and pick a folder that's consistent for everyone. Then if you click on the Vault tab, you've got a checkbox for Show Vault Comparison Icons in the local view. If you turn that off, those icons will go away and your client won't have to communicate with the server so often. Okay, the next thing you can do is turn on indexing. If you have your workgroup vault on a dedicated server and that dedicated server has Windows indexing running, then you can turn on indexing inside the Vault admin tool. And what indexing does is it builds a catalog of metadata. You can sort of think of this as a pseudo database. And it uses that catalog of metadata for searching. Now, this isn't going to affect check-in or check-out times or anything like that. However, it will pretty drastically affect your searching times, because instead of having to open up all those text files, it's going to be able to go through and it's going to be able to read the catalog instead, which is going to be a lot faster. Now, the reason I say that you should only turn this on if it's on a dedicated server is because in order to index, it's going to need system idle time. The system is going to have to be idle for the indexing to run. So essentially, even if nothing's going on your server, indexing is running, which is taking performance away from the system. So you don't want to have a bunch of applications that rely on this server if you're going to use indexing. Indexing also has another benefit. So if you have indexing turned off and you run a search, it's only searching the properties of the latest revision of the files. If you turn indexing on, it will search the latest revision of the files as well as older revisions of the files. So you're going to be able to search for a lot more stuff if you're using indexing, and that kind of shows you the performance benefit behind it. When you have it turned on, it's going to allow you to search more things because it's not going to be as difficult on the system. Okay? Next thing we're going to come to is archiving and deleting files. And you know, when it comes down to it, because of the architecture of Workgroup PDM, most of the issues you're seeing are coming from the fact that you've got a lot of files in the vault. Okay, especially a lot of text files. And so if you can archive or delete some of those files out of the vault, you're going to see some performance improvements. Now, what archiving does is it takes the actual file. You remember in those revision folders, we had something _SLDASM or _PDF or whatever it is. Archiving will take that file and move it to an archive location that's specified in the Vault Admin tool. Now, the revision folder and all the text files are going to stay there, so you can still search on the file. You can restore that file very easily, but it's going to get some of the data out of your vault so that your vault is a little bit smaller. Okay? Deleting files is going to have a more drastic effect on things like check-in, check-outs, and searching, because when you delete a file, that entire revision folder goes away. So you lose the _SLDASM as well as the PDMW files. So now your searching doesn't have to search all those text files anymore because they've been deleted. When a file gets deleted from the vault, it's not gone forever. Okay, it's moved into the obsolete folder for that project. Or if it's an entire project, it gets moved into the vault's obsolete folder. You can restore out of those obsolete folders. However, it's not as straightforward of a process as restoring an archive file. So deleting is going to give you a little bit more performance benefit, but it's going to be harder to restore those files if you need them back. Okay? Last but not least, what else can I do? Okay? If none of these things get you to a level of performance that you deem acceptable, unfortunately, your only option is to move into a different system. Okay? If you want a modern PDM system, you have to look at something that uses a mainstream database program, which is Microsoft SQL Server or Oracle. You've got Enterprise PDM, which uses SQL Server. It's a really great tool. It's got a migration path from Workgroup to it. Definitely something to keep in mind, but it's not the only thing out there. Okay? In our opinion, it's the best, but like I said, it's not the only thing. What I also want to note is that if you're looking at a new system, it's very important to understand how you can move your existing data into the new system. With Enterprise PDM, we've got a utility that moves your workgroup data into Enterprise PDM. With other tools out there, it's a toss-up. You never know what's going to be available. So really look into it if you're going to start looking at different utilities. So let's go through a summary here and just kind of talk about what we've learned a little bit. The Workgroup PDM architecture is really the limiting factor in the performance of the system. Because you don't have a database and because it's a 32-bit only program, that's going to hamper the performance, and there's just no way around that. Okay? The Workgroup PDM architecture is never going to change. It's not going to become a 64-bit program. It's not going to get a database in the background. you're never going to see the performance boosts that you would get from adding those things. It's just not going to happen to Workgroup the way that SOLIDWORKS is right now. Okay? Proper maintenance is essential in maintaining the workgroup performance. If you're not performing vault validations and log file cleanup on a regular basis, you're definitely compounding the issues. So please make sure after this that you're checking that log file and you're performing this validation, because it's definitely going to help the longevity of your workgroup system. Okay? It's also essential to have a proper local environment set up, especially if you're seeing issues where people are not being able to find file references. You want to go through here and you want to make sure that everybody is set up to be using the same working directory so that you're going to minimize those issues. Okay, proper vault management. Okay, in terms of project planning and setting up of the vault, you want to make sure that projects contain less than 2,000 files, because that can make a big difference in performance. You also want to think about developing a plan where you archive or delete older files that you don't need anymore. If you can do that, if you can get some files out of the vault, you're going to see a performance boost. It's not going to be drastic, but anything is better than nothing at that point. Okay? Really, one of the most important things here that I hope you guys have learned is to have the appropriate expectations. Okay? You know how workgroup functions now? You know where its limitations are? So I have there in bold, don't expect blazing performance from a system that stores metadata in text files. Okay? That's just not the best way to achieve performance. So, as long as you know the limitations and have the right expectations, that's fine. If you want, last issue here, you know, the performance issues in workgroup are never going to go away. It's not going to get restructured. It's not going to get a database. So if those expectations you have don't change and you want a system that's blazing fast and more stable, you're going to have to look at another tool. Okay, a couple of closing notes here, and then I'm going to answer the rest of these questions. If you're having issues, I want to make sure that you guys are contacting us. You should be calling Hawk Ridge and using that support contract that you have whenever you're running into issues. I've got our phone number up there. I've got our email up there. We've got great guys that operate those lines and can answer your questions. So please use those resources. There's going to be a recorded version of this webinar and a PDF of this PowerPoint presentation available in about a week. And it's going to be available at that location on our website. Under the events, you'll see recorded webinars. And then if you are interested in the enterprise product, you just want to see kind of an overview of it, we do a monthly webinar on the capabilities of the tool. You can sign up at that particular website and watch that. We've also got recorded versions of that webinar as well that you could watch. So let me go through here and answer some more of these questions. Let's see here. Just let me read some of these for a second. Okay, you know, some of these questions, guys, technical support questions like checked in a file and when you checked it out you didn't see a change. Stuff like that, I'm really going to want you to call the technical support staff on. I could try to answer those things, but they're really going to be more specific to the users, and so I don't want to talk about that while I've got the group on the phone. Will there be issues running clients on 64-bit SOLIDWORKS and having Workgroup PDM Vault on 32-bit? There will not be. You can have the Vault on 32-bit. You can have the Vault installed on a 64-bit computer if you want. It's just going to run in a 32-bit environment. So there's no problem running 64-bit SOLIDWORKS even though the Vault is 32-bit. In the future, will there be a dumbed-down version of Enterprise that could replace PDM Workgroup? That's a good question, Jeremiah. I don't know. There may be, there may not be. SOLIDWORKS certainly has not divulged any of those plans to me. So if I find out, I can let you guys know, but right now, I don't know the answer to that question. Does Enterprise PDM use SQL? Yes, Enterprise PDM does use SQL. It supports SQL 2005 or 2008 right now, and it actually comes with Enterprise, so you don't have to buy SQL if you get Enterprise. Let's see, okay, more tech support questions. Based on how the tool was built, about how many users maxes out Workgroup, I wish I had a number for you. I've seen Workgroup vaults with terrible performance at 5 users, but I've seen companies with 50 users using it effectively. So it's a combination of users, transactions, number of files, size of files. There's just really no one number that's going to cover it all. Okay, once you have Vault validation turned on, does the service restart automatically? Good question. It does not. You'll need to turn Vault validation on in the admin tool, and then you will have to restart the service manually. For those of you who don't know, you can go to the run command in Windows, and you can type services.msc, and that will open up the service window. And in that service window, you could go find the SOLIDWORKS Workgroup PDM service, right-click on it, and restart. So this is pretty easy to do. If you need help with that, you can call our tech support guys. They can walk you through it real quick. Let's see, what happens when you create subfolders in your working folder? So I don't recommend creating subfolders in your working folder because it's not going to be consistent with the rest of your group. If you create a subfolder and do some saves and then someone tries to open who doesn't have that subfolder, it's going to be the same problem as if you were using 2 different working folders. Okay? Let's see, can the C working folders have subdirectories or should it be a single folder? Good question. It should be a single folder. How do I count the number of files in my projects? Doug, you can run some reports on that. You could actually go in physically from the back end of the server and do that. We have a utility that can count all the files in your Vault. I suggest giving the tech support guys a call and seeing what you want to count, and they can point out the best way for you to do that. Should the service pack for PDMWorks Workgroup be the same as the service pack for SOLIDWORKS? Yes. It does not have to be the same, but in order to get the best performance possible, it really should be the same. Is there a report that can be run that'll tell me if a project has more than 2,000 files? Yeah, there is, Patrick. You just click on the project, you use the reporting function, you can right-click on the project and choose to run a report, and it will come up and let you know how many files specifically are in that project. Let's see, other than indexing, what are some issues when running on a shared server? Craig, really no other issues when running on a shared server other than memory, especially if you're running on a 32-bit server and not a 64-bit server. You've got Workgroup competing for memory with other programs, and that could really lend to some issues. Any input on running the Vault on a virtual server? Good question. Workgroup PDM is not supported on a virtual server environment. So now, that's not to say that you can't run it. What I'm telling you is that it's not supported. So if you have problems or issues running it there, and SOLIDWORKS finds out it's on a virtual server, they're not going to be able to do anything to help you. Enterprise PDM, on the other hand, is fully supported in virtual environments. So something that you could consider for the future. Let's see. Couple questions. Michael, using SOLIDWORKS Explorer on Windows 7, can't see the Vault. That's probably a simple issue of just having the add-in turned on or off. Again, I'd suggest calling our tech guys and they can work you through that. Let's see, with validation on restart, is the service technically not running while validating? Not technically, Henry. When you're validating, the service is running because that's what's performing the validation. It's just not going to allow users to log into the system until the validation is complete. Question, do we have to stop the service to clear the log file? You should, right? You don't absolutely have to, but if you're going to browse into the Vault data folder and you're going to do anything, clear the log file, restore deleted files, anything that requires you physically changing something in the Vault data folder, you should definitely stop the service. Okay, you shouldn't just be randomly browsing in there and changing things. That's going to definitely cause problems. Okay, so I think that's all the questions. If I missed anybody's questions, feel free to give a shout over here and ask for me, John Peros. I can talk to you guys about anything. Call our tech support line. They're always around to help you. And remember that this presentation is going to be available recorded and in PDF format in about a week. So feel free to download that from our website. I appreciate everybody coming. Sorry we went 20 minutes over budget here, but hopefully it's been good enough information that it was worth your time. Thanks, everybody.